It is really so good to be here today with all of you, and boy, you couldn't ask for a more beautiful New Mexico day, could you? I'm so glad that we took a moment at the beginning to thank our students and our veterans and our first responders. I also wanted to say a special thank you to all the educators and the people who work here in the public school system. That is such an important thing. So please give them a round of applause as well. I have a lot of opinions. I get to hear from a lot of people around the country who seem to think that the way we rebuild our political system and the way we rebuild the Democratic Party is going to be to wait for some charismatic Superman or Superwoman to emerge and lead us back into the White House in 2020. And I just think it's absolutely backwards and upside down. And one of the reasons why we're doing so many campaign events early on and doing these events in every corner of the state is because I really believe that the way government works best is when we invest in people at the local level. And that grows to the top. And so in my view, while I'm going to be running for the United States Senate again in 2018, I'm just as committed to making sure that we're finding the best people to run for our school board, to run for our city council, to, the mayor's positions are so important. The county commission positions are so important. These are the things where we really take back ownership of this democratic process from the bottom up. And I believe so strongly in that. That's how I got involved in politics, is running for city council back in 2003. And I can guarantee you, it was never in my plan growing up to even run for office, much less run for the United States Senate. If I had planned on running for public office, I guarantee you I would have taken a lot less differential equations and transfer courses and physics and systems dynamics, and I probably would have taken a lot more public speaking and writing courses and maybe even studied law or something like that. But as an engineer who got into this sort of backwards, becoming an engineer, going to work at Phillips Labs in Albuquerque, now Air Force Research Labs, it has allowed me to see what does work and what doesn't work in our current system. And I think it's really easy to focus on what doesn't work because there is a lot of butting heads that goes on in Washington every single week. But oftentimes we miss what is working. A great example of that is the GI Bill that we just passed that really updates the GI Bill to be a 21st century GI Bill that says if you get a Purple Heart, you should get the same sorts of benefits that, and that values people who have served our country in a way that is just as much as when we originally passed the GI Bill. And that passed because Republicans and Democrats got together and worked on it. So at a time when we were having a world wrestling match, SmackDown style fight over healthcare, we were also doing that. And that's really important because we're going to fight over some things. And we're going to have different values in different parts of the country. And we're going to have different policies in different parts of the country. But we still have to be able to work together. And being an engineer has helped me to focus on some of those places where you can sort of get the clutter out of the way and produce some results. And both in the majority and in the minority, I've been able to move forward on legislation by taking that kind of approach. I've been able to work across the aisle with people like Dean Heller of Nevada, who's a Republican. In this whole healthcare debate, he and I passed the only amendment that actually passed, which was to get rid of the Cadillac tax. And we worked on that together and have put that off for 2 years. We're going to eventually get it done. This bill wasn't the right place to do it because it would have kicked 250,000 New Mexicans off of Medicare. But the underlying issue of having a tax that really hits middle-class people the hardest is not the way we should be financing healthcare. And so finding those places where we can work across the aisle, govern and make the country work is really, really important to me. And still being willing to stand up and say, we're in an unusual time. I mean, I've never seen a White House that quite functions like this one. I've never seen the level of chaos and uncertainty, and I feel it in my friends in the Republican Party just as much as I feel it in my colleagues in the Democratic caucus. And so we're going to have to fight like heck to make sure that we protect New Mexican values in all of these debates. Now, this healthcare debate is really important, and I hope that we have finally turned a corner here. The way that repeal and replace was pushed forward would have been devastating for New Mexico for a number of reasons. The biggest is what it would have done to Medicaid expansion. And why that's so important is because not only do we have a much higher insured rate as a state, so we're seeing people directly with a doctor, directly with a provider now, instead of seeing them in the emergency room where it's really, really expensive. But the story of how our rural hospitals stood up and were part of the solution when the ACA was originally passed has not been fully realized. And the rural hospitals all took a cut in how much they got paid for services back when the ACA was passed. But they did that on the understanding that the people coming into the emergency room with no coverage were going to be covered by that Medicaid expansion. So if you take Medicaid expansion away and you kick 250,000 New Mexicans off health care, but you don't give the rural hospitals back their higher payments, that is a recipe for closing hospitals. It's a recipe for cutting back hours, for letting go of more and more special services, and consolidating everything to Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Cruces. And that is not a solution for the state of New Mexico. It simply isn't. So I hope we're at a point now where we can say, all right, this failed. Now it's time to turn a corner. And the only thing that's going to stand the test of time now is to stabilize what we have, figure out what's working, and invest in that, but also do the things, recognize that not everything's working in the ACA. It is not okay that there are large parts of the country where there's only one provider in the exchange. No one, whether they're an independent, a Republican, or a Democrat, likes a monopoly. No one likes not having a choice at all. So we need to fix those things, and the only way we're going to fix those things is by working together and getting 60 votes, some Republican, some Democrat. I hope that's where we can go now. I fully recognize the fact that my party is not in a majority, so we're not going to be able to dictate everything. But to get to yes, you need 60 votes in the Senate, which means you need some cooperation. And that is not what we've seen in the last few months on the healthcare front. I suspect the next thing that folks are going to turn to is something called tax reform. And I think it's worth saying right off the bat that sounds really good, tax reform, because everybody hears what they want to hear in it. And I think what we have to be on the lookout for is to make sure that if we pass a tax reform quote-unquote bill, that it's really about tax fairness. Because in a state like New Mexico, where we have so many hardworking people, so many small businesses, and some of my colleagues think a small business is a business with 450 people. A small business for us is 5 or 10 or 3 or 20. That's the heart and soul of New Mexico, right? Well, we have a tax system today that says if you're a hedge fund manager, you should pay a lower rate than if you're a teacher, a plumber, a small business person. And it says if you're a corporation like GE that can take advantage of every single loophole, you may not pay any taxes. But if you're a small corporation manufacturing something in a rural corner of the West, you may pay 35% in your taxes. So we've got to have an eye towards what's going to be fair. I think if we can tilt that back towards treating the small business that has 5 employees, that has 20 employees, that has 2 employees, equally on par with the GEs of the world, then we will have accomplished something. But if tax reform is just an excuse to cut taxes for the folks that are already doing pretty darn good, then that will only make the economic frustrations that we have had as a country for the last 30 years worse. So we're going to have a lot of these kinds of issues in front of us over the course of the next few years. And the thing that I would leave you with, as somebody who truly grew up valuing work because I saw my parents work so hard. My mom never finished high school. My dad didn't finish college. They both worked really hard to make sure that my sisters and I had opportunities that they did not have. They both had full-time jobs. My mom worked in a factory setting where oftentimes there were times when I was in junior high where I learned to cook for the family because my dad couldn't cook. It poisoned us all. And my mom was working 3 weeks on with overtime, 1 day off, 3 weeks on, 1 day off, lifting wheels in a factory. And my dad was a lineman and he would work overtime, but you know, he was compensated for that overtime. He never had to work 3 weeks on, 1 day off. And somehow they were able to actually make our little cow-calf operation work at the same time. And what I learned from all of that is that it was just as important that I would do the dishes as it was for my dad to go off and do what he did at the local utility company, or what my mom did at the factory. And I think we, as a country, and certainly my party, I believe, needs to send a message that we are going to value work, irrespective of how you do it. Whether you work on your feet at a convenience store, or you work with your hands in a manufacturing facility, or you work behind a desk at some IT startup, that we are going to be there to value what you do for our country, and that anybody who is willing to work hard, pay their taxes, play by the rules, not break the law, ought to have all the opportunities in the world. And the reason why people are so frustrated in this country right now is that people are worried that their kids are not going to have the same opportunities that they saw growing up. And that means, frankly, that we're in an era of no free lunches. Like, we are not going to get things for free in this country anymore. We're going to have to invest in things. We spent an awful lot of time living off our grandparents' infrastructure. We spent an awful lot of time living off our parents' educational investments. We are going to need to invest in those things at the state level, and that means it's just as important that we have people in the legislature and people in the governor's office who are going to do the right thing for job creation, for education. I don't think there is a single policy more important for the state of New Mexico. As important as the work I do for our national labs, our Air Force bases, our White Sands Missile Range, our recreation industry and our public lands is, nothing is more important for the state of New Mexico than the need for us to start investing in early childhood education, to take a sustainable piece of our permanent fund and put it into early childhood ed, so that when kids show up for that first day of kindergarten, that they know their numbers, they know their letters. If they're not reading to some degree already, they're ready to learn to read. We have to do that because we know that there are two tracks in our public education system. The kids who show up ready to learn do pretty darn well. The kids who show up and they're not ready to learn are behind for the rest of their lives. And so it's not just about my race. It's about working together to realize the potential that we have here in the state of New Mexico. And I believe that all the potential we could ever ask for sits in classrooms and churches and offices and homes across the state. And if you will give me an opportunity to serve you once again in the United States Senate, what I will guarantee, I do not love Washington, D.C. It is hot, it is humid, there's a lot of concrete, there's a lot of asphalt. It has nothing on the Moreno Valley, I'll tell you that. I could be very, very happy spending the rest of my life chasing elk and camping with my boys and fishing up here in the Sangre de Cristos. But if you send me back to Washington, D.C. to fight for you for 6 more years, I will not waste that time. I did not run for the Senate so that I could put on a tuxedo and go have dinners with important people, or people who at least think they're important. I did it because we have a state that has big needs. And it's an opportunity to fight for the things that we care about in Washington, D.C. at a time when we need to produce results for our state. And if you give me the trust to send me back there again, I will guarantee you I will not waste that time. I will not just occupy a seat. I will fight to move forward on the things that we can produce results for the state of New Mexico. Thank you.
All right, so we'll circle around the room. So,
The kids
we got some
get to ask
kids in the
questions.
corner. Love it.
Stand up and speak up.
So what are the senators doing about the infrastructure in New Mexico?
Did you say infrastructure? Yeah. Awesome. Great question. The day after the election, one of the things I said was, if the White House comes forward with an infrastructure plan, I think it's a place we can find bipartisan support. It is frustrating to me that it seems to be on the back burner instead of healthcare and tax reform, and so far we don't have a plan. And in addition, the things that have been put forward on the sort of one-pager have been things like public-private partnerships. I've been part of a city that loves what public-private partnerships can do for an airport. But public-private partnerships do not build roads in rural communities, and they don't build water pipelines in rural communities. If they did, Wall Street would have invested in our highways in northern New Mexico a long time ago. That means we have to step up and pay for those things, and I hope we will do that. I think that we could put forward a plan that did something called repatriation, where you get people to bring back those dollars from overseas that big corporations have been stashing overseas because of the differential in tax rates, and use some of that money to invest in infrastructure. There are a number of different ways we can do this, but it will take a focus from everyone. In the meantime, what I've been working on is getting private sector dollars into the state in the form of infrastructure and continuously funding things like water projects through traditional public sector means. At the end of 2015, one of the things I'm most proud of that didn't get a lot of coverage at the time, but was incredibly important for the state of New Mexico and for the country, I think, to be able to turn a corner on energy, is that we passed an energy deal. And it was at a time when the Republicans were in charge of the House and Senate. So I knew we weren't going to get everything we wanted, and they knew that they weren't going to get exactly what they wanted, that they had to compromise. And we were able to relax the oil export ban, which was no longer such a big deal because we had much better supply in the United States, and in exchange get serious investment and long-term certainty for clean energy in the country, particularly as it relates to the incentives for wind and solar. That has resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of projects in New Mexico, where steel and concrete is going into the ground right now. Wind is investing in rural New Mexico. And there are places on the eastern plains from Moriarty all the way to the Texas Panhandle where we're seeing a level of private sector investment in our state that some of those towns probably haven't seen since the railroad came to town. And it's because of that policy. At the same time, we're seeing in villages and suburban and urban areas investment in solar because of those same policies, the investment tax credit for solar. And we're seeing investment in the infrastructure, in other words, the transmission, to make New Mexico a leader in the country, where we're exporting clean electrons and we're importing dollars from other places like California. I'd much rather import dollars from California than air pollution. And we can put those dollars to work in our local communities in education and building roads again. You, sir.
My name's Bob Niemeyer. I'm a physical therapist in town, and I concur with you on the rural hospital thing. We will lose our local hospital if healthcare goes in a different direction, but that's not why I really said my question. I live in Valle Escondido, which is a small community, about 140 houses. We've done a really good job of thinning trees inside the boundary, but we're surrounded by Carson National Forest. So we're trying to get Carson National Forest to at least do 100 yards, 300 yards around our community. And they say it's going to be about a decade before we can expect to do that. And so if you know somebody...
We would love to work with you, because That's exactly where we should be investing our funding dollars, is in the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface. That's a perfect example of the kind of project that I'd love to work with you on. I used to manage 540 acres in the Zuni Mountains. I have a long history of doing thinning projects in the ponderosa pine ecosystem, which is what I'm guessing is around Valle Escondido. And I have a lot of experience sort of navigating NEPA and working with the Forest Service. So let's connect before I leave. We'll get your information and see how we can help.
Hearing from my wife, which is
Great.
really good or really bad, depending.
I look forward to it either way.
Thank you, sir.
You, sir.
I think most of the people here really care about the environment. And so I would like to ask you, I know you and Senator Udall were so instrumental in getting the Rio Grande del Norte and the Oregon Mountains national monuments. I understand that last week you were in the state with Interior Secretary Zinke. You and Senator Udall, I heard, toured him around, and I heard that he didn't even meet with Steve Pierce. I don't know if that's true, but and I heard you went out to the Sabinosa Wilderness. So if you could just give us a brief description of your tour with him and what he's thinking about our national monuments.
So thank you for the question. Obviously, the public lands have been near and dear to my heart since I graduated from college and realized that we had this birthright of hundreds of millions of acres of land that, having spent some time overseas and other places, the rest of the world just has no idea what we have here. And sometimes we ourselves don't know what we have here. It is truly incredible. You know, almost every year, either my son or myself or somebody in the family will draw an elk tag in the state of New Mexico, and we'll be able to hunt on private land or on public land, and the kind of hunt that people from other places go and pay $10,000 or $15,000 for. And it is a huge driver of our economy in the state of New Mexico. It's almost $10 billion. That is one of the largest drivers in the entire state economy. We created an awful lot of consensus, and by we, it really, both of those projects, Oregon Mountains and Rio Grande del Norte, came from the grassroots up. And they came with the support of the county commission, of the local councilors, of the local mayors, of all the people who really made that happen. We were the ones that the media focused on because we were in Washington, D.C. doing that work. But I can tell you, as somebody who used to be an outfitter guide, those things don't come together unless you have the local support to make it happen. When Secretary Zinke came here, I think he got a sense for just how much local support there was. He said as much to the Albuquerque Journal when we had him out at Sabinosa. He said, I've been to some places where it seems like the local support is not good. That is not true in New Mexico, that more people clearly want these things than don't want these things. I hope he has the good sense to follow the rhetoric where they've said it's about whether or not there's local support. Because if they do that, our national monuments will be absolutely fine. And every single credible poll and every look at what the local governments have said will bear that out. I think we'll just have to see, what he does. On the Sabinoso, it was a pleasure to get him out someplace on horseback to see what it really looks like on the ground there and what makes sense. Because if you get out of Washington, D.C., and you see things firsthand, some of the rhetoric and the ideology that can be bound up in the staff sometimes, when you get on the ground, sometimes you're like, well, the only thing that makes sense is this. And so we were able to, I think, create a common sense of what that would look like at Sabinosa that we hope to have final resolution on, hopefully in time for this fall. One more, and I'm going to let Joe choose because we haven't heard from...
Let's go with Gail right over here, and then we have some students too. So we'll do two.
Question with letting you know I'm a big supporter of yours and vote for you and plan to vote for you. But several months ago, you voted no on a bill that would have allowed generic importation of drugs. the publicity that I read about that, there were 17 Democratic senators who had taken substantial monies from the pharmaceutical industry. And also it was explained to me that your reason for voting no was because there is a certain percentage of drugs that are made overseas are not pure and have a problem. And I just want to know, do you have any idea of how to improve that system of verifying the drugs so you could vote yes, so you could help a lot of people with less expensive drugs?
Thank you so much for that question. It's Gail, right? So that was not a bill, that was an amendment on getting rid of, setting up the budget reconciliation to get rid of the ACA. So if it had passed, it would not have necessarily been a good outcome. On the core issue of reimportation, I actually talked to Bernie Sanders on the floor that night, and we started a process. And I will tell you, I have no qualms about, if you go into a drugstore in Canada and buy something that says it's made by Merck or Pfizer or whoever, you're getting the exact same thing you get in the United States. We have had instances, however, where mail order has been manufactured in Eastern Europe, sent to Canada, relabeled, sent into the United States, and it was absolutely not what it was supposed to be. So we have a system for track and trace in the United States that applies to all of our legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturers. And what Senator Sanders and Senator Booker of New Jersey and myself, Angus King, a number of others, folks got together after that, and we wrote legislation that would allow reimportation but require the exact same level of public safety and track and trace that is applied to American pharmaceuticals. So it puts the American manufacturers on equal playing field, equal footing with if you're in Canada. If you're in Mexico and you can meet those standards, you can reimport as well. And that was the approach we took to it. We rolled that out a few months ago. I wish it would have gotten the same level of coverage as the original amendment did, but that is something we're pushing forward with. In addition, we're pushing forward on something that I think could be an even bigger lever on the cost of pharmaceuticals, which is out of control in the United States and is a huge burden in the state of New Mexico. And that is, we are trying to let Medicare Part D negotiate for the cost of those drugs, because if you get Medicare negotiating for the cost of those pharmaceuticals, that has a downward pressure on the entire market. And I can tell you, as somebody whose father gets his prescription drugs through the VA and whose mother gets hers through Medicare Part D, when you can negotiate for that big a pool, it makes a big, big difference. And I think that is probably the most important thing we can do to bring down the cost of prescription drugs in the United States of America.
Thank you, Senator. So we're going to start taking some of these banners down and moving to Las Vegas. But while we do that, the Senator's going to stick around and mingle for a little bit. So thanks everybody for being here. Really appreciate it.